The rainy night. It was a night that seemed to blur the line between despair and hope. Heavy raindrops crashed against the streets, turning the quiet suburban roads into rivers of flowing water. The dim street lights flickered in the storm, casting uneven shadows that danced like ghosts across the neighborhood. Officer Mark Reynolds squinted through his windshield as his patrol car crawled through the downpour, his thoughts clouded with fatigue. It had been a long shift, nothing unusual for a Friday night, filled with routine calls that left his mind in a daze. But something felt different about this night. Maybe it was the way the rain drummed relentlessly on his car roof, or maybe it was just the eerie quiet that hung in the air, despite the storm's fury. The empty streets around him carried a strange stillness that gnawed at his instincts. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It was past midnight, and sighed, eager to finish his rounds and return to the station. As he turned the corner, his headlights caught a small figure huddled at the side of the road, barely visible through the curtain of rain. For a split second, he thought it might be a discarded object, a trick of the light. But then it moved. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't an object. It was a child. Slamming on the brakes, Mark quickly pulled over, the tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the downpour, his shoes sinking into the puddles that had formed on the sidewalk. The cold rain stung his face as he approached the small figure, who was crouched beneath a tree, drenched from head to toe. "Hey there," he called out gently, holding the flashlight low so as not to startle the child. "Are you okay?" The little girl didn't move at first. She sat curled up, clutching something to her chest. Maybe a stuffed toy, Mark couldn't tell. Her thin shoulders trembled under a soaked hoodie, and her small shoes were muddy and waterlogged. When she finally looked up, Mark's heart sank. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. He crouched down, holding his jacket over her to shield her from the rain. "What are you doing out here all alone?" he asked softly. "Where are your parents?" The girl didn't answer right away. She stared at him with wide, frightened eyes, her lower lip trembling. Finally, she whispered, "Mommy doesn't want me anymore." Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. Those words, spoken with such innocence, cut through him like a knife. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Where's your mommy?" The little girl shook her head, clutching her toy, a worn-out stuffed bunny, closer to her chest. She said I had to go away," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rain. "She doesn't want me." Mark's heart twisted in his chest. He could feel the weight of her words settle like a stone in his gut. No child should ever be left alone like this, especially not in the middle of a storm. "What's your name?" he asked gently, trying to keep his voice calm despite the rush of emotions. "Lena," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My name is Lena." "Okay, Lena," Mark said, his voice firm yet kind. "You're safe now, all right. I'm going to help you. We'll figure out what to do. But first, let's get you out of the rain." Mark carefully picked her up, noticing how light she was, far too light for a girl her age. He opened the back door of his patrol car and placed her gently in the seat, covering her with his police jacket. As he buckled her in, he felt the cold seeping from her small frame. She was shivering uncontrollably, her skin pale and damp. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe, okay?" Mark reassured her as he slid into the driver's seat. "Everything's going to be all right." Lena didn't respond, but she hugged her bunny tighter, her tiny body curling up in the warmth of the jacket. Mark glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his mind racing with questions. How long had she been out here? Where was her mother? Why had she been abandoned in such a cruel way? As he drove, the rain continued to pour, creating a rhythmic tapping that filled the silence. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. He had been an officer for nearly 10 years, and in that time, he had seen his share of neglect and abuse cases. But there was something about this little girl's quiet despair that stirred a deep anger in him. He picked up his radio and called into the station. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. I need to report a found child. Female, approximately 6 years old. Found walking alone in the rain on Maple and 5th. I'm bringing her in." The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker. "Copy that. Officer Reynolds. Child Protective Services have been alerted. We'll have someone waiting when you arrive." Mark set the radio down, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. He glanced back at Lena again, her small figure almost lost in the oversized jacket. She looked so fragile, so vulnerable. He couldn't help but think of his own daughter, Emma, who was only a few years older than Lena. The thought sent a wave of protectiveness surging through him. As they neared the station, Mark spoke up again. "Lena, I'm going to take you to a place where there are other nice people who will help you, okay? They'll make sure you're safe." Lena nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the stuffed bunny in her lap. "Will Mommy come get me?" she asked quietly, her voice so small it nearly broke Mark's heart. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer. "We'll figure everything out, I promise," he said finally, though his mind raced with the reality that Lena's mother might never come back for her. As they pulled into the police station parking lot, Mark noticed Lena tense up, her little hands gripping the bunny even tighter. He parked the car and turned to her, offering a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Lena. I'll be right by your side the whole time." He helped her out of the car, wrapping his arm around her shoulders to shield her from the rain. The station was warm and brightly lit, a stark contrast to the storm raging outside. Officer Sarah Lopes was already waiting by the front desk, her kind eyes immediately softening as she saw Lena. "This is Lena," Mark explained, his voice steady but his heart heavy. "She needs our help tonight." Sarah nodded, crouching down to Lena's level. "Hi, sweetie. I'm Officer Sarah. We're going to take care of you, okay?" Lena glanced up at Mark, seeking reassurance. He gave her a gentle nod. "It's okay, Lena. Officer Sarah is really nice." Reluctantly, Lena let go of his hand and followed Sarah to a nearby chair. Mark watched them for a moment before heading to his desk to file the report. His mind was spinning with questions that for now had no answers. But one thing was clear. Lena needed someone to fight for her, and Mark wasn't going to let her down. The search for truth. The soft hum of activity in the police station was a stark contrast to the chaos that churned inside Officer Mark Reynolds' mind. Lena sat quietly with Officer Sarah, sipping a cup of hot chocolate, her small hands trembling as they gripped the warm mug. Despite the warmth of the station and the blanket now draped over her, Lena still looked fragile, as if the weight of her world had crumbled beneath her tiny feet. Mark watched from across the room, a deep frown creasing his forehead. He had been through countless situations in his career, from dangerous high-speed chases to volatile domestic disputes, but something about this case unsettled him on a different level. Lena wasn't just a lost child. She was a symbol of something far more tragic, a little girl discarded like she didn't matter. "Mark, are you okay?" Officer Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. She had approached him quietly, her eyes filled with concern as she glanced at Lena. Mark nodded, though his mind was far from calm. "I'm fine. I need to figure out what happened to her. There's something off about this." Sarah followed his gaze, watching Lena as she carefully dipped a cookie into her drink. "She's so young. It's hard to believe anyone would just leave her out there like that. What kind of mother does something like this?" "That's exactly what I intend to find out," Mark replied, determination hardening his tone. "I'm not letting her slip through the cracks like so many others. I need to know why her mother abandoned her. There's more to this story." He turned back to his desk, pulling out his phone and dialing the number for Child Protective Services, CPS. As it rang, his eyes flicked back to Lena, who was now speaking softly with Sarah. The image of her sitting alone in the rain, clutching that ragged bunny, replayed in his mind, filling him with a sense of urgency. "CPS, this is Amanda," a voice answered on the other end of the line. "This is Officer Reynolds from the Eastwood Police Department. I've got a child here, around 6 years old, found walking alone in the rain. Her name is Lena. She claims her mother told her she had to go away. And there's clear evidence of neglect. We need someone to come down and help assess the situation." "Understood, Officer Reynolds," Amanda replied, her voice professional but sympathetic. "We'll have someone on site within the hour. In the meantime, keep the child comfortable and gather as much information as you can." Mark thanked her and hung up, his mind already whirring with the next steps. He needed to dig deeper into Lena's background, but there was one glaring problem. Lena had no last name. She hadn't mentioned it, and without it, finding any records could be like searching for a needle in a haystack. He decided to start by checking for any missing child reports. Sitting down at his computer, he pulled up the database, typing in the keywords that might lead to any relevant information. Lena, 6-year-old girl, Eastwood, missing child. As the search loaded, Mark's thoughts wandered. Lena's story gnawed at him like an unsolved puzzle. Why would a mother, or a stepmother, abandon a child like that? Was there something more sinister happening behind closed doors? Abuse? Neglect? It didn't add up. And Mark's instincts told him there was more beneath the surface than Lena's innocent words revealed. The screen flickered to life, but no results came back matching the description of a missing girl named Lena. Mark frowned, leaning back in his chair. No reports. No open cases. No leads. He sighed, frustrated but not deterred. If CPS couldn't find a match either, then his next step would be to talk to Lena directly. She was young, but kids her age often remembered important details about their lives, even in traumatic situations. He needed to ask her more about her home, her family, anything that could give them a starting point. Mark walked back over to the break room, where Sarah was still sitting with Lena, the little girl now looking a bit more relaxed, though her face remained solemn. He crouched down beside her, his voice gentle as he spoke. "Hey, Lena, you doing okay?" Lena looked up at him, nodding slightly. Her eyes were still wide, but they no longer brimmed with the overwhelming fear she had earlier. It was as if she was beginning to trust him, just a little. "Lena, do you remember where your house is?" Mark asked softly, hoping she might give him something to work with. "Or maybe your last name. Can you tell me more about where you live?" Lena hesitated, hugging her bunny closer. Her lips trembled as she spoke. I don't know the address. It's a big house. We have a lot of stairs." Mark nodded, encouraging her to continue. "That's okay. Do you know the name of the street? Or what your mommy does? Anything that could help us?" Lena's brow furrowed as she tried to recall. "No, but we have a big tree in the front yard. And there's a park nearby. Mommy works sometimes, but she's home a lot. She gets mad when I ask her for things." Mark exchanged a glance with Sarah, who had the same concerned expression on her face. "Do you have any other family, Lena? Someone else who takes care of you?" "Daddy was there before," she said, her voice growing quieter. "But he's gone now. Mommy says I cost too much money." Mark's jaw tightened. He had heard enough. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, and none of them painted a good picture. He needed to find out who Lena's mother was, and why she had thought abandoning her daughter was an option. "We're going to keep you safe, Lena," Mark promised, placing a reassuring hand on her small shoulder. "You don't have to worry about anything right now. We'll figure this out together." Lena gave him a small nod, her eyes lowering as she hugged the bunny tighter. Her innocence in the face of such neglect was heartbreaking, and Mark knew that no matter what, he had to make sure she was never hurt like this again. As he stood up, Sarah pulled him aside, her voice low. "What's our next step?" "CPS will be here soon," Mark replied. "But in the meantime, I'm going to dig deeper. Something's not right about this. No missing reports, no last name. It's like she doesn't exist on paper. I'll check local property records, see if I can find any matches based on her description of the house. And I'll need to visit that park nearby." "Good idea," Sarah agreed, glancing back at Lena. She's been through a lot. We need to make sure she's safe." Mark nodded, determination fueling his every thought. There was no way he was letting Lena slip through the cracks. Too many kids like her fell into the system, forgotten by the very people who were supposed to protect them. He wouldn't let that happen. As he walked back to his desk, his mind was already buzzing with possibilities. Somewhere out there, someone knew why Lena had been abandoned. And Mark was going to find out the truth, even if it meant turning over every stone in the city to get the answers. Because this wasn't just about Lena anymore. It was about justice. And Mark Reynolds wasn't the type of officer to let an innocent child's cries go unheard. Mark spent the next hour combing through property records, focusing on homes in the Eastwood area that matched Lena's vague description. Several large houses stood near the local park, but nothing immediately jumped out as a match. Frustration gnawed at him, but he pushed forward. He couldn't afford to miss anything. The search felt endless, but finally, a name popped up. A woman who had recently moved into a large house near Eastwood Park. Her name, Tricia Maxwell. No criminal record, no prior history of child services involvement, but something about her name tugged at the back of Mark's mind. He sat up straighter, heart racing. Could this be Lena's mother, or her stepmother? He didn't know for sure, but it was a lead. A start. Mark grabbed his coat, nodding to Sarah as he headed for the door. "I've got a lead. I'm going to check it out." As he stepped out into the stormy night once more, Mark knew one thing for certain. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. And whatever it took, he was going to find it. Unveiling shadows. The rain had not let up. It hammered the streets with relentless force, cascading off rooftops and flooding the gutters. Officer Mark Reynolds gripped the steering wheel tightly as his car sped through the wet streets of Eastwood. The rhythmic thrum of the windshield wipers was the only sound in the car, aside from his own heavy breathing. Tricia Maxwell. The name repeated itself in his mind, echoing like a warning. He didn't know why it felt so significant, but something about it was off. He had seen countless names in his line of work, but the coldness that accompanied this one, it was like a shadow he couldn't quite shake. He slowed down as he neared the street Lena had described, the dim glow of the streetlights barely cutting through the thick veil of rain. The houses here were large, old, and stately, standing tall like silent sentinels in the storm. They seemed out of place in a world where a little girl could be left in the rain, unwanted and abandoned. Mark pulled up in front of a house that fit Lena's vague description. A large oak tree in the yard, a porch with peeling white paint, and several windows glowing with light. This had to be it. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the rain batter the roof of his car as he mentally prepared himself. What kind of woman would abandon her own child? The thought infuriated him. He had seen neglect before. He had seen the damage it could do to a young mind, how it left invisible scars that often lasted a lifetime. But he wasn't just angry. He was confused. Lena was a sweet, innocent girl, and he couldn't fathom what would make her mother, if this Tricia Maxwell was indeed her mother, discard her like an unwanted possession. Mark stepped out into the rain, pulling his collar up against the downpour. As he approached the house, he could see shadows moving inside through the front window. A woman was pacing, talking on the phone, her gestures sharp and agitated. Mark rang the doorbell. The muffled sound of it echoed inside the house. He waited for a few moments, hearing the woman's voice grow louder as she neared the door. When it swung open, he found himself staring at a tall, slender woman with sharp features. Her eyes, icy blue and unwelcoming, scanned him quickly before narrowing. "Yes, can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Ms. Maxwell?" Mark asked, keeping his voice neutral but firm. "I'm Officer Reynolds with the Eastwood Police Department. I need to ask you a few questions." Her expression shifted slightly, from irritation to a forced smile, though the coldness in her eyes remained. "What's this about, officer? I don't believe I've done anything that requires police involvement." Mark held up his badge. It's regarding a little girl named Lena. We found her wandering alone in the rain earlier this evening, and she claims to live in this neighborhood." The moment he mentioned Lena's name, Trisha's smile faltered. It was brief, just a flicker, but Mark didn't miss it. Her eyes darkened, and her posture stiffened as she crossed her arms over her chest. "I'm sorry, but I don't know any girl by that name," she replied, her voice suddenly cold and dismissive. "You must have the wrong house." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You don't know Lena. She's about 6 years old, dark hair, brown eyes, and she mentioned a large tree in the yard, and a house with lots of stairs." Trisha's gaze flickered toward the large oak tree in her front yard, and for a split second, Mark could see her hesitation. She was hiding something. "I don't have any children," she said, her voice flat, but there was something else there now. "Fear, and I don't appreciate being accused of abandoning someone else's child." Mark studied her for a moment. He had learned over the years to read people, to see past their words and observe the small details that betrayed their true emotions. And right now, Trisha Maxwell was lying. He could see it in the way she avoided his gaze, the way her fingers twitched nervously at her sides. "May I come in?" Mark asked, his tone still calm but firm. It would be helpful to speak inside, out of the rain. Trisha's hesitation deepened, and for a moment, Mark thought she might slam the door in his face. But then, with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes, she stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. The interior of the house was as cold and uninviting as its owner. The decor was minimalistic, with sharp, clean lines and a monochrome color scheme. It was immaculate, but it felt more like a showpiece than a home, a place where warmth and life had been carefully scrubbed away. "Would you like something to drink, officer?" Trisha asked, her voice syrupy now, though the tension in the air was palpable. "No, thank you," Mark said, his eyes scanning the room as he followed her into the living area. He noted the framed photographs on the mantel, pictures of Trisha with other adults, but no children. Odd. Trisha sat down on the pristine white couch, crossing her legs and folding her hands neatly in her lap. "So, officer, why are you here again?" "This girl, Lena, was it? She's not my responsibility." Mark remained standing, his eyes locking onto hers. "Lena mentioned her mother telling her she didn't want her anymore. She said she was sent away. Does that ring any bells?" Trisha's smile faltered again, her fingers tightening around each other. "As I said before, I don't know any Lena. You should be looking for her real mother, not bothering me." Mark's patience was wearing thin. He took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "Ms. Maxwell, I'm trying to help a little girl who's been abandoned. If you know anything, now is the time to tell me. Otherwise, this situation is going to escalate." Trisha's eyes flashed with anger, but she quickly suppressed it, standing up and pacing toward the window. She stood there for a moment, her back to him, staring out at the rain-soaked yard. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and bitter. "You don't know what it's like, officer. You don't know the burden of caring for a child that isn't yours. Lena, she's not my daughter. She's my stepdaughter. Her father left us. And now, I'm stuck with the mess he left behind." Mark's heart sank. There it was, the truth, or at least part of it. Trisha Maxwell hadn't abandoned her own daughter, but she had abandoned someone else's, a little girl who had no one else in the world. "And you think abandoning her in the rain was the solution?" Mark's voice was sharp now, the anger creeping in. "She's 6 years old, Ms. Maxwell. She's terrified, and you left her alone." Trisha turned around, her face a mask of cold indifference. "I didn't leave her to die, if that's what you're implying. I left her near the park. I figured someone would find her eventually. She's better off with someone else, anyone else. I can't. I won't raise her. She's a constant reminder of him, of everything I've lost." Mark stared at her, disbelief coursing through him. He had seen many forms of neglect in his time as an officer, but this was pure selfishness. A woman who had chosen her own comfort over the well-being of an innocent child. You can't just discard a child because she reminds you of your past, Mark said, his voice thick with disgust. You don't get to decide when a child stops being your responsibility. Tricia met his gaze, her eyes hard. I didn't ask for any of this, officer. I didn't ask for her. Mark stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. She didn't ask for this either. There was a long, tense silence. The rain continued to pour outside, the sound almost deafening the quiet room. Finally, Tricia looked away, her shoulders slumping slightly. You need to leave, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark didn't argue. He had what he needed. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door, his voice firm. CPS will be in touch, and I'll make sure they know everything. Without another word, Mark stepped out into the storm once more, his heart heavy. He had uncovered the truth, but it wasn't a victory. There was no satisfaction in discovering that a woman had discarded a child out of spite and selfishness. There was only sadness. As he drove back to the station, Mark's thoughts were consumed with Lena. She had been through so much, and yet she had survived. She had clung to that little bunny, her one piece of comfort, as if it were her lifeline. But now it was Mark's turn to be her lifeline. He had promised her that she would be safe, and he intended to keep that promise, no matter what it took. A heart's resolution. The rain hadn't stopped by the time Officer Mark Reynolds returned to the station. The heavy downpour mirrored his mood as he walked through the automatic doors, his wet boots leaving muddy imprints on the tiled floor. It had been hours since he had found Lena, and while he had some answers, the most important questions still lingered in the air like a thick fog. What would become of her now? The station was quiet, with most officers either out on patrol or wrapping up their shifts. Mark's mind churned with everything that had transpired at Tricia Maxwell's house. He couldn't shake the cold indifference in her eyes, or the way she had spoken about Lena, as though she were nothing more than a burden, an unwanted reminder of a life Tricia wished to forget. He walked to his desk, the weight of his jacket heavy on his shoulders, and sat down in his chair. The office phone sat in front of him, glaring as if daring him to make the next move. Mark knew he had to call Child Protective Services, CPS. It was protocol. But the thought of turning Lena over to the system gnawed at him. He had seen too many kids bounce from foster home to foster home, their fragile spirits broken by rejection after rejection. His gaze drifted to the small plush bunny he had brought from his patrol car. He had promised Lena he would keep it safe until he returned, and now the sight of it sitting on his desk made his chest tighten. The truth was, he didn't just feel responsible for her safety. He felt connected to her in a way that went beyond his badge and duty. There was something about Lena's quiet resilience that struck a deep chord in him. Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, trying to clear his mind. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. He had to think logically. But the memory of Lena's tear-streaked face as she stood alone in the rain wouldn't let him rest. "Mark, you okay?" The voice of his partner, Officer Jenny Morales, broke through his thoughts. She had just come in from her shift, shaking off the rain from her dark curls and giving him a concerned look. "Yeah," Mark said, though the word felt hollow. He motioned toward the plush bunny on his desk. "Just thinking about that little girl I found earlier." Jenny raised an eyebrow, her eyes softening as she noticed the weariness in Mark's expression. She walked over, leaning against his desk. "That the one you found wandering by herself? Did you figure out who she belongs to?" Mark nodded, but it was a grim acknowledgement. "Her name's Lena. Stepdaughter of a woman named Tricia Maxwell, but belongs to might be stretching it. Her stepmom practically abandoned her." Jenny's face darkened with disbelief. "She what?" "She left her at the park," Mark said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "Apparently, she doesn't want her anymore. Said Lena reminds her too much of her ex-husband." Jenny let out a long, low whistle. "Damn, that's cold. So, what now?" "CPS." Mark hesitated. It was the obvious next step, but that didn't make it any easier. "Yeah, that's the plan. But you know how it goes. Lena's already been through hell, and now she's going to end up in the system. Who knows where she'll land? Jenny frowned. That's rough. Poor kid. But you did your part, Mark. You found her, kept her safe. You can't fix everything. Mark's jaw clenched. Jenny's words were logical, but they didn't sit right with him. He wasn't looking to fix everything. But there had to be something more he could do. Something better than handing Lena off to strangers. Maybe, Mark muttered, his thoughts still racing. But I can't shake the feeling there's more to this. Lena's just a kid, and she's been failed by everyone who was supposed to take care of her. What happens when we hand her over to CPS? Is she going to end up in a group home, bounced between foster families? She deserves better than that. Jenny sighed, sitting down across from him. I get it. It sucks, and it's not fair. But what can we do? The system's broken, sure, but it's the best we've got right now. Mark leaned forward, elbows on his desk, hands rubbing his face. I don't know. She deserves a chance, Jenny, not more disappointment. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. Finally, Jenny spoke again, her voice softer. You know, there are other options, Mark. You could adopt her. Mark interrupted, shaking his head with a bitter laugh. I don't know anything about being a father, Jenny. I'm a cop. My life is unpredictable. What if I mess it up? What if she needs more than I can give? Annie gave him a pointed look. What if she needs exactly what you can give? Stability. Someone who actually cares. You're good with kids, Mark. I've seen it. And it's not like you'd be doing it alone. There are resources, people who can help. Mark's heart pounded in his chest. The idea had crossed his mind, but he had quickly dismissed it as unrealistic. He was a bachelor, with no experience in raising a child. His apartment was barely big enough for him, let alone a little girl. But the more he thought about it, the more the idea began to take root. He thought about his own childhood, growing up in the foster system after his parents died in a car accident. He had been shuffled from house to house, never feeling truly at home. He knew firsthand the damage that kind of instability could do to a child. And he couldn't bear the thought of Lena going through the same thing. You think I could do it? Mark asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenny smiled softly. I know you could. And more importantly, I think Lena would be lucky to have you. You already care about her, Mark. That's more than a lot of kids in the system ever get. Mark sat there, staring at the plush bunny on his desk, his mind spinning. The idea of adopting Lena terrified him, but it also filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't a decision he could make lightly. But maybe, just maybe, he could be the one to give Lena the stability and love she so desperately needed. Before he could think too much about it, Mark picked up the phone and dialed CPS. The line rang for what felt like an eternity before a woman's voice answered on the other end. Child Protective Services, how can I assist you? Mark took a deep breath, steadying himself. This is Officer Mark Reynolds. I found a young girl named Lena Maxwell earlier this evening. I need to report the situation. The woman on the line asked for details, and Mark explained everything. The rain, the abandonment, the cold stepmother who had discarded Lena like an unwanted toy. As he spoke, the enormity of what he was about to do settled over him. He was taking the first step towards something life-changing, both for him and for Lena. When the call ended, Mark sat in silence for a long moment, his hand still resting on the receiver. His heart raced, but he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Jenny gave him an encouraging smile. So what's the next step? Mark met her gaze, determination hardening his features. I'm going to see if I can foster her, at least for now. And if things go well, maybe more than that. Jenny grinned. I knew you had it in you, Mark. You're doing the right thing. As the night wore on, Mark found himself unable to shake the feeling that this was meant to be. Lena had come into his life for a reason, and maybe, just maybe, he was the one meant to give her the love and security she had never known. The rain continued to fall outside, but for the first time that night, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it. For Lena, tomorrow, he would begin the process. Tomorrow, he would change both their lives. New beginnings, fragile bonds. The next morning, sunlight peeked through the thin curtains of Mark's apartment, bathing the room in a soft golden hue. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind the fresh scent of damp earth and clean air. The world outside seemed calm and hopeful, but inside Mark's mind, a storm still raged. He had barely slept after making the decision to foster Lena. Questions had swirled through his head all night, each one tugging at his confidence. Could he really do this? Was he ready to become a father figure, especially to a child who had already been through so much trauma? His small apartment wasn't exactly child-friendly, and his work as a cop meant long, unpredictable hours. But every time doubt threatened to overwhelm him, he remembered the look in Lena's eyes, the raw vulnerability, the loneliness. He couldn't stand the thought of her being passed around by strangers, her fragile trust in the world broken even further. Mark sat up in bed, running a hand through his messy hair. He knew today was the beginning of something new, something he hadn't planned for, but somehow felt deeply responsible for. There was a sense of urgency bubbling beneath his calm exterior. He glanced at the clock. It was almost 7 a.m., and soon he'd be picking up Lena from the temporary shelter CPS had placed her in overnight. With renewed determination, Mark got out of bed, showered, and dressed in jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. He poured himself a quick cup of coffee, its bitter warmth grounding him. As he sipped, his gaze drifted toward the empty living room. The apartment wasn't huge, just a one-bedroom space that had always been enough for his solitary lifestyle. The idea of bringing a child into it seemed daunting now. He'd have to figure out where she would sleep, what she'd need, and how to make this unfamiliar space feel like home for her. But he knew it wasn't just about furniture or toys. Lena needed more than material things. She needed love, stability, and safety. Mark didn't know how to offer all of that, but he was determined to try. A quick knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. It was Jenny, standing there with a beaming smile and 2 large bags in hand. "I brought reinforcements," she said, holding up the bags like a prize. "Thought you might need some help getting ready for Lena." Mark raised an eyebrow. "What's all this?" Jenny walked past him into the apartment, setting the bags down on the couch. "I stopped by a few stores early this morning. Picked up some clothes, bedding, and a few toys. I figured you wouldn't know where to start, so I did the heavy lifting for you." Mark blinked, overwhelmed by her thoughtfulness. "Jenny, I don't even know what to say. I wasn't expecting all this." She waved a hand dismissively, her usual no-nonsense attitude coming through. "Please, you're doing something incredible for that little girl. The least I could do is help you prepare. Besides, I've got a niece around Lena's age, so I know what kids like." Mark gave her a grateful smile, feeling a little more hopeful with Jenny's support. "You're a lifesaver." Jenny grinned. "Don't mention it. Now let's get this place ready. Lena's going to need a space of her own, even if it's just temporary." They spent the next hour transforming Mark's modest apartment. Jenny unpacked the bedding she had bought, a set of soft, lavender-colored sheets and a fluffy comforter, and they made up the couch, which would have to serve as Lena's bed for now. Mark cleared some space in the living room for the few toys Jenny had picked out: a stuffed bear, a coloring book, and a set of crayons. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The transformation wasn't perfect, but it was warm and welcoming in a way that made Mark feel a little more prepared for what lay ahead. By the time they finished, the apartment looked brighter, almost as if it were waiting for Lena's arrival. Mark took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that still gnawed at him. He had no idea how this was going to go, but he was ready to face it. "Looks good, huh?" Jenny said, standing back to admire their work. I think Lena's going to like it here. Mark nodded, though his heart still pounded with anticipation. Yeah, I hope so. At 9:30 a.m., Mark found himself pulling up outside the CPS shelter. It was a nondescript building, one of many facilities designed to house children in emergency situations until a more permanent solution could be found. His stomach twisted as he stepped out of the car. This was the moment when everything would change, for him, but more importantly, for Lena. He walked up the front steps and pressed the buzzer. A moment later, the door clicked open, and a middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted him. Officer Reynolds, right? She asked. Mark nodded. Yes, I'm here to pick up Lena Maxwell. The woman smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. Lena's waiting for you in the playroom. She's had a tough night, but she's been very brave. Come with me. Mark followed her down a narrow hallway, his heart racing with every step. When they reached the playroom, he saw Lena sitting quietly in a corner, holding a battered doll. She looked small and fragile, her face pale and her eyes distant, as though she had already learned to withdraw from the world. But when she saw Mark, her expression shifted, just a flicker of recognition, a hint of relief. Hey, Lena, Mark said softly as he crouched down to her level. Ready to go? Lena nodded, clutching the doll tighter. She stood up slowly, her movements careful and cautious. Mark couldn't blame her. She was stepping into the unknown, leaving behind everything familiar, even if it had been painful. He reached out his hand to her, and after a moment's hesitation, Lena placed her small hand in his. As they walked back to the car, Mark could feel the weight of responsibility settle over him more heavily than ever before. This wasn't just about keeping Lena safe anymore. It was about giving her a sense of belonging, of knowing that someone cared enough to stand by her no matter what. The drive back to Mark's apartment was quiet. Lena sat in the back seat, her eyes wide as she stared out the window, watching the world pass by. Mark glanced at her through the rearview mirror, wondering what was going through her mind. He wanted to say something to comfort her, but words felt inadequate. What could he possibly say to a child who had already been through so much? When they arrived at the apartment, Mark helped Lena out of the car and led her inside. She hesitated at the door, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar space, unsure of what to expect. Mark knelt down beside her, giving her a reassuring smile. This is your new home for now, he said gently. I know it's different, but we'll make it work. And if there's anything you need, anything at all, just let me know, okay? Lena nodded, but her expression remained guarded. Mark could tell it would take time for her to feel comfortable, to trust that this wasn't just another temporary stop in her already turbulent life. Come on, let me show you your bed, Mark said, guiding her toward the couch that had been made up with the lavender sheets. It's not much, but I hope it's comfortable. Lena approached the couch cautiously, running her hand over the soft fabric of the comforter. For a brief moment, a flicker of something close to wonder crossed her face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She sat down, pulling the comforter around her small frame, her eyes darting toward Mark as if to gauge his reaction. Mark smiled, trying to ease her anxiety. I'm glad you like it. And look, he said, picking up the stuffed bear Jenny had brought. This little guy is all yours. Lena took the bear from him, holding it close to her chest. She didn't say anything, but the way she clung to it told Mark everything he needed to know. She was scared, uncertain, but she was also holding on to the tiny glimmers of hope being offered to her. Mark stood up, giving her some space. I'll be right here if you need me, okay? We'll take it one step at a time. As he watched Lena settle into her new surroundings, Mark felt a surge of determination. This wasn't going to be easy. He knew that. But for Lena, he was willing to try. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, and maybe he would make mistakes along the way. But one thing was certain. Lena would never be alone again. Healing wounds and growing trust. Over the next few days, Lena's presence in Mark's life slowly began to shift his world in ways he hadn't anticipated. Initially, the silence between them was thick, each moment laden with the weight of their shared uncertainty. Mark found himself tiptoeing around his own apartment, trying not to overwhelm her, while Lena remained quiet, her large brown eyes always observing, always cautious. She barely spoke at first, responding only with short nods or single words. Mark would ask her if she wanted anything to eat, or if she needed help with something, and she would just nod, her words hidden somewhere behind a wall he couldn't breach. It was clear that Lena had built up protective barriers, defenses formed after years of neglect, rejection, and emotional wounds that no child should bear. Mark, unused to being around children, especially ones as withdrawn as Lena, fumbled through those first days. He wanted to reach her, to find a way to let her know she was safe, but everything felt delicate, like a glass bridge that could shatter with one wrong step. He spent his time trying to figure out what might bring some light into Lena's life. He asked Jenny for advice, but even she admitted it would take time. Lena had to feel like she could trust him before she would truly open up. The days began with Mark leaving for work early, his heart heavy every time he had to tell Lena he'd be back later. He hated the idea of her being alone, even with Jenny checking in and helping out. He'd come home to find Lena sitting on the couch, still clutching the stuffed bear Jenny had bought her, as if it were a lifeline. Sometimes she would watch TV, but she always seemed distracted, lost in thought. But something shifted one afternoon when Mark returned from his shift. As he opened the door, he noticed Lena wasn't on the couch. Panic briefly surged through him before he heard a soft rustling from the kitchen. He turned the corner to find her standing on a chair by the counter, struggling to open a box of cereal. For the first time, he saw something more than silence in her expression. There was frustration there, a desire to do something, to be independent, even in the smallest way. Mark smiled, feeling a strange swell of pride in her small act of initiative. "Need some help with that?" he asked gently, walking over to her. Lena flinched slightly, not used to someone offering assistance without a bark of authority or annoyance. She looked up at him, her eyes unsure, but after a moment, she gave a tiny nod. Mark took the box from her, his movements slow and deliberate. "Let's see. Here we go." He opened it with ease, pouring some cereal into the bowl she had set out. "Want some milk with that?" he asked, glancing at her. Lena hesitated, then nodded again. As he poured the milk, Mark couldn't help but feel how significant this small moment was. It was the first time she had sought to do something on her own, the first time she had allowed him to help her without pulling away or retreating into herself. It was progress, even if it was only a single step. They sat together at the small kitchen table while Lena quietly ate her cereal. Mark didn't push her with questions or force her to talk. He had learned that silence was sometimes the best way to communicate with her, to show her that he was there without overwhelming her. After she finished eating, Lena looked up at him, her gaze lingering longer than usual. For a moment, Mark wondered if she was going to say something, but she simply slid off her chair and walked back to the living room. He let her go, knowing that trust wasn't built in a day. It was earned slowly, piece by piece. That night, as Lena lay on the couch under the lavender comforter, Mark sat at the small desk in his bedroom, going over paperwork. He had been keeping close contact with the social worker assigned to Lena's case, trying to navigate the complexities of the foster system and what it meant to take care of her long term. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, and he had no idea what the future held, but he was committed. The thought of Lena being shuffled around from home to home, possibly losing the tiny bit of stability they had begun to build together, gnawed at him. But something unexpected happened that night. As Mark prepared for bed, he heard a soft knock on his door. His heart skipped a beat. Lena had never initiated contact like this before. He opened the door to find her standing there, clutching her stuffed bear tightly, her face partially hidden by its soft fur. "What's up, kiddo?" he asked softly, kneeling to meet her at eye level. For a moment, Lena stood there, her small frame trembling as if she was fighting some internal battle. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, she spoke. "I had a nightmare," she said, her voice shaky but clear. Mark's heart ached at the vulnerability in those few words. He wanted to scoop her up and tell her everything would be okay, but he knew he had to be careful. Lena wasn't used to comfort. She wasn't used to relying on anyone. Instead, he reached out and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked, his tone soft and inviting. Lena shook her head quickly, her grip on the bear tightening. "That's okay," Mark said, offering her a reassuring smile. "You don't have to. But if you ever do, I'm here." Lena stood there for a moment longer, her eyes searching his face as if she were trying to decide whether or not to trust him. Then, slowly, she took a step closer, her small hand reaching out to grab the hem of his t-shirt. "Can I stay with you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. This was the first time Lena had asked for anything, the first time she had reached out for comfort instead of retreating into herself. He nodded, his voice catching slightly. "Of course you can," he said. He led her to his bed, and she crawled under the covers, still holding her bear close. Mark lay beside her, careful not to crowd her, but close enough that she knew he was there. They lay in silence for a while, the room dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Just as Mark thought Lena had drifted off to sleep, she spoke again, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. "Why did my mommy leave me?" The question hit Mark like a punch to the gut. He had no easy answer for her, no words that could make sense of the pain she had endured. He swallowed hard, his heart heavy with the weight of her question. "I don't know, Lena," he said honestly. "But I do know that it wasn't your fault. None of this is your fault." Lena didn't respond, but Mark could feel her inching closer to him under the covers, her small body seeking the warmth and security he offered. He lay there, his heart aching for the little girl beside him, knowing that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But in that moment, he realized something. Lena had been let down by so many people, abandoned by those who were supposed to protect her. He couldn't change the past, but he could be there for her now. He could be the person who didn't leave, the person who showed her what it meant to be truly cared for. As Lena's breathing eventually slowed and deepened, signaling that she had fallen asleep, Mark stared up at the ceiling, his mind racing. He had started this journey not knowing what to expect, unsure if he was capable of being what Lena needed. But now, as he lay there with her sleeping beside him, he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to help her heal, to give her the love and stability she deserved. No matter how difficult it would be, he wasn't going anywhere.